if we truly believe God is our creator, then our identity has to flow from God, our creator, or else we will never get it right. We'll always be unhappy. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the core self. It's when our parts take over the seat of our core being, when it takes over our identity as a child of God, when it takes over our yearning and longing and eyes fixated on Christ himself, that's when our brokenness is exposed. And that's when we become fragmented. That's where the multiplicity becomes disorder.
Welcome back to another episode of PPK. We're back at it, boys. Back at it. Our commitment to being consistent at least lasts another round.
We're lasting so far, man.
So far, so good. So far, so good. Coming to you from AZ. Keone coming all the way from Cali. What's going on, Keone?
Yo, crazy Cali, man. The only one stuck out here, but it's all good.
Trying to hold it down and call me Cali. It's all good.
Yeah, I'm keeping the vibes pretty sane here, but at least in the meantime, so we'll see.
Yeah, for the time being, right? God's will be done in all things. But yeah, excited to be back. And for today's inspiration, we'll be kicking it over to Keone. What do we got, Keone?
So, since this is probably my third inspiration of all 44 episodes, I guess this idea came to me from a clinical psychologist. His name's Dr. Peter Malinowski. You can check him out. Maybe we can put a link to his website. He's an amazing Catholic therapist. I want to say he's somewhere in the Midwest. I don't remember the state, but he is a internal family systems therapist. And so internal family systems therapy really talks about the idea of a system and parts, not only like in a family system. So we think of like the different members within the group that make the family as a whole, but IFS or internal family systems relates it to the human person and how we all have parts within us. And so Dr. Peter Malinowski relates those internal family systems principles to a Catholic perspective, in line, obviously, with the teachings of the magisterium and the revealed truth that is the Catholic religion. So I thought it would be really cool for us to talk about the idea of parts as it relates to ourselves and our own human formation. Because I think oftentimes, people who are at least a little bit hungry to work on their life, to better themselves, to get on the road to sanctity, to get to heaven, there's often this over spiritualization, or there's like this spiritual bypass where we ignore like any human formation, and we jump straight to the spiritual practices. And what Dr. Peter Malinowski talks about is a lot of human formation and the idea that grace builds upon nature from St. Thomas Aquinas. So I think it's important that we kind of break open this idea of what are parts, and recognizing that we all have parts within us, all these different beliefs, opinions, assumptions, practices, emotions, feelings, wounds that exist within us. And if we don't integrate them and allow and we're going to break it open in a second, our core self to be at play, rather than one of these parts dominating or blinding. If we don't do that, one, we can't love ourselves. If we can't love ourselves, we can't love those around us. And more importantly, we cannot love God. And so it relates to really the two greatest commandments that God gave us, loving God and then loving our neighbor as ourselves. And that implies being able to love ourselves. And so that's what I hope we can get out of it is I see it in my own work. There's this idea of self-love that is false, very modernistic, very this like self-care, complacency / just get into your feels or do whatever feels pleasurable type of self-love, self-care. And then there's also this, any client, any mental health, you're coming in there because there's a part of you that's broken. Whether it be that anxious part of me, that depressed part of me, that trauma, that wound that is existing within me that's affecting my daily life. And so what I'm hoping we can break out is like, how can we integrate these parts and allow our core self, who we were designed to be integrated, and so that we can actually love ourselves, which bleeds into loving our neighbor, and then ultimately loving God himself.
Yeah, you bring up a good point on, the ancient philosophers like Aristotle would say, know thyself. And I think what a lot of people suffer from today, especially in marriage and relationships in general, is the inability, it's the self-knowledge, self-awareness, right? Having an understanding of wounds. You talk about family systems. I mean, Meeks and I were just at the Catholic Men's Diocese of Phoenix Men's Conference, and even Bishop Olmsted was talking about the importance of family systems and the importance, of course, self-knowledge falls into that, and family of origins, and we can get into a whole bunch of that, both spiritually and I think psychologically, to be able to try to better understand yourself. But you bring up a good point, Keone, on that, because I think a lot of people suffer from lack of understanding of oneself. And then when you don't know how to deal with that, obviously it manifests itself into undesirable behavior, or just creates a roadblock to healthy and sustainable relationships. Meeks, you got anything to say to kick it off?
Yeah, I think when I was listening to one of the podcasts that Dr. Peter Malinowski, is that how you say it, Keone?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So when I was listening to it, it was just funny because it was kind of wrapped around this idea that I think the more you grow into your faith, as Catholics, we all get is Paul in the Romans saying, like, why is it that I do what I don't want to do?
Yeah.
And
Romans 7 problem. Yep.
Yeah. So, which we all do, right? We all know, like, that's the first part is, I think for a lot of, at a basic human level, a lot of it, we kind of have an understanding because we have something called conscience, which is like our, God's way of placing morality within us naturally. And then the way that we can kind of figure it, we need revelation and all that kind of stuff. But I think for a lot of us, it's this question, like, why do we keep doing these things? Especially as young men, that are faced with all the, that's the thing about, our podcast is that, like, we're all guys, we're all just a bunch of dudes. We're just all a bunch of dudes who are literally just like everyone else. And we're just trying to figure it out. And we're trying to let people in our journey of, like, hey, guess what? We still all do the same things that we don't want to do. Just like Paul does, who's better than all of us combined. And so I thought that was super fascinating. And really just the idea of, like, when you hear parts, it can be like, okay, like, what are you getting at here? Or like maybe unity. And now we're back into, you know what I mean? We're back into those vibes. We're in the energy. I'm a Gemini. Maybe that's something to do with it. I don't know. But what really is it about? It's a lot of the both and, right? The Catholicism is a lot of both and. And so I think it's a normal tendency we do these things like, okay, I'm introverted, right? My dad's extroverted. Keone's more introverted. Okay, well, what's your this, that, I don't know, sanguine versus all these other stuff.
Yeah.
And I think it's a tendency to box us into this idea that we're all homogenous personalities. And what Dr. Peter was saying is that that's not really the case ever. And it's really never the case in anything, right? I think you look at politics. It's not just red and blue. There's a whole gray area. Always. Nothing's black and white, I don't think. So that's a good way to approach our own personalities and the way we see people, right? So I think the idea of the parts is to better understand how we approach ourselves, as Keone said, so we're better able to relate to others and love others ultimately. And so, yeah, I thought it was interesting because we're both a unity and a multiplicity. And then one of the examples that Dr. Peter brought up was this idea that, when a man comes home from work and, it's 6 o'clock, he's a little hangry, he's annoyed, he wants to get his food, there's a lot of things. That's not simply a mood of his, but that's actually a part of him. And that's a part that you need. And a lot of these parts were filled with all of them. And right. And what Keone was pointing to, we're going to dive into more, was this core self that needs to be the conductor. But a conductor can't make music without all of its parts. He can't make music by himself. This conductor that's just doing this and by himself, that's called a tweaker. That's what we see in San Francisco and on and Santa Monica. That's what they do. They conduct and no one's there. But what he does need is the parts. So when we have the parts, those aren't just moods for ourselves. It's like, just trust me. I have a lot of parts. Okay, I have those moods. That's called my life every day. I'm in an eternal mood. So it's a big part of me. So I think it's just interesting to put that in perspective, because you start diving deeper into it of, okay, if this is more than a mood, what does that mean? If this is an actual part of my being, more than a mood, more than like okay, I need to eat it. I need to eat, right? I need to eat dinner in order for me to fulfill this part. But if there's a part to it, I think it's a little more complex than just simply, all right, let me drink some water and get some Advil so this like annoying headache can go away and I can stop, screaming at everybody when I'm driving. So, I don't really know what that means because I was a marketing major. So what that means is that when I was in class, I was watching Kobe highlights, and thinking about what I was going to drink that weekend. You know what I mean? So this is a little bit more for Keone. I'm going to give you guys a little bit more space maybe here, but let's break that open.
Yeah. Before I turn it back over to Keone, I think one of the things we do want to be careful of, because, and we were talking about this even with moms, right, Keone? Just trying to be able to understand this concept of parts of the system, because you tread a thin line as people, right? Everybody wants to try to figure out like the answer, the why to, why am I angry? Why do I struggle with a certain vice, whether that's lust, whether that's impatience, whatever that may be. And when we start to name them, it's when we can start to tame them. But at the same time, if it's something that's a part of me, right? I think of this in the context. I mean, you can probably speak to this the most, you and your mom and your sister, when it comes to family systems and dysfunctional families, and when it's like a kid with their two parents, right? When parents split up, or when a parent tries to pin you against your other parent, you do realize like that kid is 50% the other person, right? And so that's a part of them. So when you say your dad is deadbeat, or your dad is X, or your mom is this, you're so much like your mom, like that. That's exactly what they think is like, man, that's a part of me, and I'm conflicted with this venom that you're spewing towards that way, or is this a part of me that I can't get rid of? I mean, St. Paul, the Romans 7 problem is that why do I do the things that I don't want to do, but I don't do the things that I want to do, and for us as Catholics and obviously all Christians, when we understand the original fall and original sin, and we battle with, right, concupiscence and the natural inclination towards sin. So we want to be able to try to tease this out. Obviously, we want to try to pull it down from something that may seem, abstract or esoteric or, unattainable. But how do we kind of go into this, Keone, be able to kind of help our listeners on what we're trying to achieve in this episode?
I guess simply put, we were made in the image and likeness of God. And God himself is a multiplicity and a unity. He is one God in three divine persons, right? They're distinct, but they are one. And we think about how the marital union is designed. Throughout Scripture, the nuptial union is a mere image of the Trinity in a way that we can grasp as human beings. And that's the two distinct individual people with their own wounds and beliefs and backgrounds seeking to become one. And what happens when a couple holds on to those parts of themselves, that belief, that cultural background, their family unit, the pride, their political ideology, their finances, whatever, when they're not willing to let go of those parts and integrate it with a unitive formation of the marriages break, they sever. And that's really, now we look more internally. Not only are we relational with other people, relational beings, we're also relational internally. And so we have to have an ordered relationship with ourselves. And it's easy to see the design of it when you see the disorder that occurs. And so there's I don't remember the exact title. There's a documentary on Netflix. It's like the 24 personalities of, I don't remember the dude's name, but it's the personality disorder, dissociative identity disorder, or multiple personality disorder, all these disorders that you see. It's so apparent when this person has, at the time it was like 8, and then went all the way up to 24 personalities.
Wow.
And there's one that's a kid. There's one that is like this teenager that's like angry. There's one that was like this mischievous, I don't know if it was like a girl. And then there's one that was like the head coach, like the one who like speaks for the actual human, like the guy. He speaks for him when he's sleeping. And when he's sleeping is when he's triggered. And so you see like the parts within us when they become disordered, when they become what Dr. Peter and I think maybe Richard Schwartz, who's the founder of Internal Family Systems, what he might call is blending, is when the parts are blended. And when what happens is now the drums trying to fight for control with a violin, and not at the end of the day, we're not allowing the conductor to lead the orchestra, so it becomes chaos. Mm-hmm. And so when we see the lack of unity, now we see like in Scripture with the Gerasene demoniac, like my name is Legion because we are many. We see it in Scripture and we know it. In James chapter 4, verse 1, it says, the conflicts among you, where do they come from? Not your cravings that are at war within you. And so we think of like these parts. We have parts of ourselves You
Mm-hmm.
think of the common phrase, I'm really torn on what to do. Well, why are you torn? You're one person. There should be no tearing within you. But we're fragmented human beings. We have parts of us that, maybe my pride wants me to seek that money, that fame, and that position. But my prudence over here is telling me, well, you have a family and it may not be the right time right now or whatever. So there's parts that exist within us. And if we're not constantly seeking to integrate them and unify them in line with our core self, and the core self is ultimately who God designed us to be, right? In line with his teachings, following our conscience as it pertains to our intellect and our will. If we allow them to get out of hand, now the angry part of us is taking the role of the conductor, hijacking the orchestra, or the lustful part, or the anxiety or depressed part, or the trauma filled part. If they hijack the orchestra, the song isn't um, isn't performed the way it was is God designed it to be performed. And so that's where we see the disorder. And that's a very natural level, right? I see people coming in to therapy and there's a part of them they want to work on. There's that part of that wound that they grew up, right? The part that damaged child that was abused or abandoned or didn't have a secure attachment or was was humiliated, right? And that part of them is is playing out in some way because it's blended with the core self.
Mm.
That core self now it loses its identity. It's not allowed to be the conductor because that part is blending with the core self. And what we need to do is integrate all of us. We need to love all of us. Um, is that making more sense? Or maybe we can break it. Do you guys have thoughts as like non-mental health?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on something when you said being who God created you to be, and I think that's obviously when we think about it from what we're trying to do here at this podcast, right? Priest, prophet, king. For those of us who are seeking to do the will of God and to integrate really or align our wills with God's will, and I think what you're talking about, Keone, and I think what we can continue to tease out during this episode is that conflict of being who you're created to be in the midst of all your brokenness, all your wounds, all the things that are tugging at you, distractions, and things that are happening to you that that you're not even aware of, right? Like, I think this is why I think one of the key motivating factors to us even being involved in ministry and things like Priest, Prophet, King is like, there's a different way, man. There's a different way than what the world tells you. This whole self-help, self-medicate, do you get yours? That mentality doesn't work. It just leads to greater emptiness, greater longings, and greater hurt and destruction in your life and the life of those whom you love. So I think it's just trying to help people understand, because okay, maybe they're picking up what you're laying down, right? In the sense of going, all right, I get it, but how do I tease it out, Keone? How do I know my core self? Or Meeks, how do I know what those other parts are, right? And how do I distinguish? And when you say integrate, what does that actually mean? Right? Because maybe there's a part of you just really don't want, right? And I think that's where a lot of people struggle. So they try to suppress and ignore. And what we're trying to say is like there's parts of us, right? It's like you don't get to choose your parents, right? Like, so sucks for you guys that you got me as dad, right? But it's like one of those things where it's like, okay, but to try to suppress that, I mean, I have those wounds, right? It's like, well, no, God allowed that to happen, but what if I want to get rid of it, Keone? Like, what if I don't want that part? Those are the things I think you're trying to figure out and trying to help people understand.
Yeah. So what Dr. Peter talked about, and I really like this, the way he conceptualized it, the idea of a no-go zone. And so there's parts of us that, I guess, they throw themselves into this no-go zone, and God isn't allowed there. God isn't allowed to heal that anxiety part of me, that part that always wants control, the part that wants my plan to work now. Because when I was, 2 years ago, I tried to surrender, or I tried to just let it happen, and I got, I lost my job, or, something, I lost a loved one, something happened and I lost that control, right? Or there's that trauma side of me, right? That like Pops, that father wound, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a no-go zone for a lot of people, and maybe for the rest of their life, where God isn't allowed there in that part of me. Not that they don't go to mass, not that they don't, they're not seeking to, maybe try to live a decent life, but when it comes to that part of them, God isn't allowed there. He can go, so that person, so maybe you, Pops, you'll go to the chapel and you'll pray about your wife and your kids and your job, but you won't pray about your dad. You won't
Yeah.
pray about the hurt that you have with dad, because
Yeah.
that's a no-go zone. And if we
Yeah.
don't allow God to heal every part of us, well, one, now we don't love ourselves, right? We can't, because we're not giving ourselves fully to God. And if I don't give myself fully to God, how can I really love all of me? And now there's a part of me that's still stuck in my original sin, my brokenness, my wound, and we're
Mm.
not allowing the healer to come in. So now I'm just fragmented. And so that's really what it starts with, is one, recognizing those parts, good and bad, that athletic part, that intellectual part, the part that learns quickly, the part that is humble, but also the part that is wounded and stuck in sin and vice. And we have to understand all of it, integrate it, understand it, become aware, and allow God to embrace every aspect of it. And that takes really a lot of humility and peace and surrender. And so I think that's really what it comes down to, is just recognizing every part of us. And we talked about, I gave that talk to these confirmation students on the idea of false religions, right? And how we
Mm-hmm.
put our stock in the fitness version of me, or that we put our stock in the fashion, or we have all these influencers that have profile pages, right? But
Mm-hmm.
they're putting their worth in simply a part of who they are. It's just a
Yeah.
part of them. Your
Yeah.
fashion, your athleticism, your any sort of skill is just a part of you. And what happens when we put all our stock in a part? And that's the equivalent of what happens when we allow just the violinist or the cello player to take over the orchestra. Well, now what happens when the cello player messes up? What happens when the violinist doesn't show up, is having a bad day? Well, the whole orchestra, the whole performance is done, because now the conductor isn't able to maneuver and utilize the wholeness of the orchestra to pick up where that maybe that part of you is slacking, right?
Yeah.
To integrate and say, okay, regardless of that wounded violinist, we're gonna make the most of it, and we're gonna heal, because we're unifying together, right? We're working together as a team. Um, and so I think that's really what it's at. And for those who might be doubting, like, oh, is this even in the Catholic realm? Like, seems a little in the psych, new agey. I know psychology can be a little interesting, and I'm saying that from being within the field. I get it.
Mm-hmm.
But you see Jesus in Matthew 26. He's in the garden and he says, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine. Like, think about that. You see the internal conflict. He joined us in all things but sin, right? So he had this battle within him. Because why? Because he's a human being. He had a part of him that didn't want to face death and torture. There's a part of him that didn't want to endure that pain. But there's also the part, his core self, that is completely, everything was given to God, right? I don't want this, Lord, but your will. And that's where that we see the core self. Identify that part, that scared part within me. Recognize it, acknowledge it, and say, I'm here for you, but I surrender to God. And now that part of them doesn't take over, doesn't hijack the performance. Jesus did what he was called to do by the Father.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the fact that he acknowledged that part within him that was scared, he surrendered it to God, and then he gave everything to God, knowing that he would be his strength. And so
You,
we're supposed to be emulating Jesus, right? And that's it right there.
you bring a couple things, like when you talked in my own journey. I think I shared this with you guys, and I think I even shared this at the confirmation retreat, Keone, that we had, where I said, when I was coming back from Deacon Harold's mission, that when he was out here in AZ, shout out to Deacon, and Mom and I were driving back, and we were just talking about forgiveness, and Mom had turned over to me and goes, do you think you forgave your family? And I really had to ponder it and being like, that's a great question. I don't know. I can say intellectually I have. Intellectually, I've easily said that. But to your point, Keone, if I'm sitting there in the chapel and I pray for everybody under the sun, and then I do struggle with that aspect of me, right? And there is that conflict, right? Because that's a part of me. I mean, genetically speaking, my upbringing, my family. And so it's rough. But going back to even the point you just made about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus is his whole mission, his purpose in life was to die. To die for us in order to reconcile us with the Father. And I think when we think about that, like each of us are destined for greatness, called for a purpose that only we can fulfill in our uniqueness. Even though created in the image and likeness of God, we were uniquely created for a specific purpose that only we can all fill individually. And that is what God's will is, right? To know, to love, and to serve him according to those two greatest commandments, to love God and to love thy neighbor. But then you have everything else, right? That get that desire to say, I don't know if I can do that. Like that's better suited for somebody else. But man, there's a lot to that, Keone. Meeks, what are your thoughts so far on this topic?
I think the question, I have a couple of things, but I think the question of a core self is a tough one, but I think it's meant to be contemplative for your entire life, understanding what that means. And I think we understand that, we're God's children and those things, but what the depth of that meaning, like I'm somebody who thinks things, like I said before, like logically and stuff like that, and I kind of struggle with the feeling, the real relationship with Jesus Christ, a personal thing, as opposed to like objective based or reading based in order to feel like I am where I'm at. So I think that question can only be answered through our entire lifetime of prayer and reflection, like what's your real core self. One of the great things we heard from Bishop Olmsted today, who made the Manual for Men, which a lot of people read. I know I saw that a lot of times at Franciscan, and then Into the Breach.
Into the Breach, yeah.
And one of the things he says that he prays every day, essentially to find his identity in Jesus Christ, right? That is what you're saying. Mm-hmm. So, obviously that's where our core self is, but to figure out sort of the depth of that, I think is something really to be reflected upon and contemplated upon for your life, and something that we're all trying to figure out ourselves. And then the second thing, I think with the parts, something that I've like dabbled in my, 3 minutes of reflection I do maybe here and there, is trying to figure out where some of these parts come from. I think that's a brutal thing to think about and to sit with. Like, why is it that I'm irritated in this? Like when I start asking myself with that, and it's not that a lot of times I come up with the answer and it scares me, like, whoa, my gosh, I'm a psychopath. But it's more like I don't know. Like, where is it? There's a lot of times where it's like you get into these depths and you're just like, man, I don't know. But I think that's why we're called to silence. I think that's why we're called to prayer, contemplative, reflective, because it's like, yeah, man, I don't think any of these answers can be thought of in a couple seconds or 2 minutes of reflection. There's a lot of time I'm like asking, like, why is it that I get so caught up when something isn't going how I plan it to go in my head? Why is it that I get so caught up when someone's just like talking and it feels like it's just ringing in my ear? Like, why do I get that? Like, where does that come from? I don't know these. I really don't know these answers. That's something for me to obviously continue to sit with. But it can be for sure scary, I think, to address some of those parts. And for me, being completely honest, I don't feel like it had a lot of traumatic things happen in my life. Mm-hmm. I feel I've been very blessed with the parents and the family that I have in the community at large, and being able to go to Franciscan, and a lot of great things happen. But I still am flawed as anyone else, and it's like almost when you don't have those traumatic experiences, it's not as easy to point to, oh, I have this, that's why I'm this way. But for me, it's like, no, I think I'm just naturally psycho for some reason. I don't like those are the questions where it's kind of hard to figure out, like, man, not that I wish to have those, but it's like you really got to dive deeper almost into this. Okay, like what happened to where, like, what separated me at this point from my life and this point in my life? So yeah, I mean, that's just
But let's go. I want to throw it back to Keone, because I think this is the thing you probably deal with on the mental health side of it, right? Even though that's a great point that you call out, right? It's not as easy to identify like the elephant in the room, right, or the major trauma that you experience. I was just explaining to somebody today, the director of marriage and family life for the diocese, and we were talking about just marriage prep and family systems, along, just all the things we need to do to help prepare the domestic church. And I was talking to him about adverse childhood experiences and about the scale of 1 to 10, the 10 different ACEs. Of those, we'll have to probably do one. Get you, Mom, and Bria talking about that on a counseling episode. But I said, everybody, 67% of people have one ACE. People who experience 4 or more are more than likely to experience, obviously health related issues. And I was telling him, I'm like, I have at least 7, if not 8 of those ACEs, right, on that chart. But the problem is, that when I think about it in the context of this episode is, it's like when we talk about those moments where you're triggered, and I've seen grown men cry 60, 70, 80, 90 years old, whether it be at, a men's group or a conference or whatever engagement that we may be at, where they're literally crying about something that happened when they were 8 years old. They immediately go back to that 8-year-old moment with dad, or that 12-year-old moment with dad. And part of you, objectively speaking, is saying what? Hey, bro, you're not that 8-year-old anymore. What's going on? But immediately they're brought back to that place for whatever reason. And I think that's the part, Keone, I think as we kind of try to, bring this back around from maybe some things that maybe feel a little bit out of touch or out of reach, or like, how do we process that? As Meek said, like, what do I do with that now that I'm buying what you're selling, bro? And then I'm like, yeah, you know what? I struggle with that X, with that issue. And then I don't know what to do with it, which is a scary thing. It is absolutely scary. It's easier to just say, it's not there. It's quote unquote easier, but it's there. It's there, and it's manifesting itself in some type of behavior. And you hope that it's not going to be detrimental to you and your relationships.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. I want to rewind back to Miko's point on the core self, and like kind of helping people understand what that is. And I'll give kind of two brief examples. So Pops, when you were talking to the confirmation students and you're saying, hey, what do you guys want to do when you get older? What do you want to do for a career? Right. And they're giving I want to be a doctor. I want to be an engineer. I want to whatever. Right. Then you said, what does God want you to do? I think that's the core self right there. The part that invites God in and seeks their wholeness of their identity through the eyes of God. I think that's the simplest way. Because remember when we talked about, if we want to rewind, for any of those who want to go back, I think it's episode 2, when we talked about, if we truly believe God is our creator, then our identity has to flow from God, our creator, or else we will never get it right. We'll always be unhappy. And that's the core self. It's when our parts take over the seat of our core being, when it takes over our identity as a child of God, when it takes over our yearning and longing and eyes fixated on Christ himself, that's when our brokenness is exposed. And that's when we become fragmented. That's where the multiplicity becomes disorder and chaos. And so I think that's an important point. Now, going to your question, and even Meeks was talking about, like, where are these parts coming from? Well, you guys are asking the right question, is recognizing, why am I so impatient? Like, I think it just starts there. Like, why am I impatient? Well, do you know your temperament? That's important. I know there's like Meeks was saying, like, there's a box to it. Like, it's not all. The beauty of the Catholic Church is the both and, right? There's a lot of it that is temperamental. That is meaning, you're born with these tendencies. But there's also a lot of it that are bad habits, right? Because you can have a tendency, a drawn towards impatience, but you're exercising the will in the moment. You're making a choice to be impatient. And over time, those little actions solidify the tendency to where now the tendency has a better shooting percentage of it actually playing out in real life. So yes, we have tendencies. We have people who are have a higher tendency of anger, depression, alcoholism, whatever it might be. But that's only half the story. Right? We have actions, and that's the beauty of the brain, also in neuroplasticity. Like, we can change these things. But the first question is back to Meek's point, why? And that's what a lot of, at least for me, and there could be different approaches, and I think it depends on the client. When I'm working with a client, regardless of whether it's one huge traumatic experience or they're just coming because they're sad or there's a series of events or whatever, a lot of it is just reflecting. And I think that's something that's so lost, and that might be one of the biggest contributors to why we've just gone haywire as far as mental health, is because silence and reflection is not a part of our daily life. Like, think about, even in the Catholic circle, how many people actually do an examination of conscience? Like, I even think about, for me, I'm like, it has to be like, through the Hallow app, and I have to have some nice music, and he has to kind of prompt me through it, because right now it's hard for me to just sit in complete silence, at least for the examination part, and go through the course of my day. How did I see God work in my life? Where did I fall? And all those moments of reflection. I think that's lost. And so when I'm in a therapy session, okay, why? Notice that tendency towards anger, and ask yourself, Where is that coming from? Where, like, and it's like, do people truly know the part of themselves, that angry part? Do they know it, or do they shun it? Are they ashamed of it? Are they frustrated towards that part? Where what happens? It becomes a no-go zone. Just it becomes in the corner. We put it away, right? And what Richard Schwartz, the founder of Internal Family Systems, what he talks about is you want to get to the point where the client, so the person he's working with, is able to be curious. They say take a part of curiosity towards that part that they don't like, that traumatized part, that anxiety-ridden part, that depressed part, whatever part that is sabotaging their life. It could be multiple parts, but you want to take on a state of curiosity, not judgment, not shame, not frustration. Just learn about it, because that part has a role. Whether they're acting out their role in a way that is beneficial in your life, that is positive, that is how God designed it, it's doing what it thought it needed to do in that moment, maybe because of a series of events or traumas or wounds or whatever. It's reacting in a way that was designed to survive. So the part is, first we have to get to know that part. Well, why? Just become curious. Just interview that part within us. Reflect on it. And once you're able to understand that it probably did it in our broken way for our good, right? Because we know from St. Thomas Aquinas, we can't do evil for evil's sake. We see it, some good coming of it. If we can put our guard down, our shame, our frustration, our shunning of that part, and invite it into the orchestra again and say, all right, what happened? Okay, you're safe. You're not, like you said, you're not that 8-year-old kid. But a lot of the times we don't even want to bring that 8-year-old kid back into the orchestra. He's in a filing cabinet, like 3 rooms down, because God can't touch that part. Right. And so our love for God, our love for our wife, our love for ourselves is fragmented, because I'll give you everything except that wound. Right. And then when that wound shows up in our day-to-day exchanges, or worse, when our partner or a friend or whatever has a similar wound, oh, it's an explosion, because I haven't come to terms with it myself. And so I think when we talk about how do we even recognize the parts, and what starts with reflection, those parts of you. And that, I think the simplest way to think about it is our vices and our virtue. What are things you really struggle with? What are your vices? Recognizing, because they come from something. Obviously concupiscence, obviously, knowing your temperament is super helpful, but also there's so much that comes into who we are. And if we don't reflect on it, and we don't work on those things on a natural level, not just going to confession, not just going to mass, because those are important, 100%. Those are the sacraments, those are the grace, but grace builds upon nature. And if we're not working from a natural realm, oftentimes the grace is just hitting a wall, and we're not really even truly allowing God to heal that, because we're giving only like a piece of ourselves, and God wants our whole heart. And so that's really where the grace builds upon nature is, are we actually giving everything to God, or are we only giving like 50% of the orchestra?
Yeah, I think one of the speakers today, when he was talking about his dad, was a witness speaker, and he was talking about his dad was a deacon. And yet, so you think about that, right? So as somebody who is obviously discerning diaconate, right? God willing, the church will call me to those holy orders. It's still one. You are the one, you can get all 7 sacraments, basically, right? Because holy orders, there's so much grace upon that. But the way he described it, he has father wounds from his dad, who was a deacon of the church, who struggled so much with anger and projected it on the 10 kids. And so the kids were always happy when dad was gone, right? And so it was just a reminder of that. But a couple of things, and I'll kick it over to Miko as we wrap this up. But when you talk about that need to reflect in silence, and I've spoken about this before in different formats, and JP2 talks about original nakedness, and it just throws me back to the garden. I think it was JP2 and maybe even Pope Benedict, when they talk about one of the reasons why we struggle with silence, and I'm paraphrasing, is because that's when we are actually see ourselves in our nakedness. And that being naked, right, requires vulnerability, and there's a level of intimacy. And when you struggle with that relationship with obviously God in particular, then we'll be like Adam and Eve, right, in the garden. Where are you? Well, we hid, for we knew we were naked. And it's just like, huh, we're on to something here. Because a lot of what we try to do is to hide ourselves in that nakedness, which in this context, meaning the fall, and in these parts that are perhaps negative in our lives, whether they be experience, whatever wounds, there's a negative connotation with that. And there's a shameful aspect of it where, Keone, we've probably said this before and we've heard it before, right? Between the difference between guilt and shame, right? Guilt is feeling bad for what you did, and shame is feeling bad for who you are, right? And that I've heard it said that before. So meaning that you've now, and this is the devil's ploy, right? Is he calls you by your sin where our Lord calls you by your name. And so when he calls you by your sin or that wound or that brokenness, that big Goliath in your face, that's what the devil gets you in the grip. And therefore, that's where the struggle is and the conflict is, in my humble opinion, with the part, right? Because when we're talking about this, we're not talking about the good parts. Everybody loves those, right? It's like, oh yeah. I'm super calm. I'm super this. I'm super that. It's the negative parts that we don't want to deal with, that we don't want to face, that we don't want to go through healing. So Miko, what say you as we wrap this up?
Yeah. One of the points I wanted to bring up really was a good point by Keone, though, was essentially the core self being, where does God want you to be? I think that's just such a good one, something that I've been trying to figure out for the longest time, because I went from a lot, as you guys know, I had a lot of different things on my mind of what I wanted to do. I came into Franciscan, poli-sci major, maybe thinking about law school and just following a lot of politics stuff and thinking that that's something I wanted to pursue. And then came out a business major somehow, just trying to figure out what exactly am I trying to do with my life. And I think one of the cool parts of parts, that's not a good one. One of the cool segments of the parts that we're talking about here is how we all play a part in the body of Christ in the church. And I think we all need to figure out sort of where that core self lies within our role in the church, or our role in evangelization, or like the kingdom, really, because I think without understanding that, it's so hard to, you can kind of get lost, right? Like, oh, well, who am I? I'm just a whatever it is, a carpenter, or I'm just a sales guy here. I'm not going to go do talks like John and Keone or all this kind of stuff. When it's like, maybe you're not really finding your core identity, perhaps. Like, that's the way that your core self is going to sort of push you towards exactly where you need to be. I think that clarity is so key, something that I'm continually trying to narrow on and reflect on, of, where is it that I'm called, like me, Miko Sablan, right? That's such a hard thing to do. And a lot of times we can feel like we're supposed to be, look what they're doing, or maybe I should be evangelizing and being a witness in this way. But we're all called to our very own specific ways. I think the best way is obviously, being a father. I think it's more important than, being a speaker or all this other stuff. Or just, being what it means to like be a good friend to people. That's always a good, so I think that's a key thing, is understanding our core self and our identity with Christ can help us understand what our role is in the kingdom, what our role is in evangelization. And obviously that's kind of one of the great things about, this podcast that we do, that we're all in such different ways. With Keone is mental health, with me being the least educated one of the group, with my only business major, no master's, but me just focusing on different a media of creativity, something that I feel like, okay, I'm really called to this aspect. What I struggled with for so many years, like, where is it? Okay, I want to do this because I wanted to be some sort of witness so bad. I wanted to, you know what I mean? When I thought I was going to be involved with basketball, like me and Keone did, we always wanted to bring, our faith or some sort of platform to be able to witness to kids or whoever it is, anyone that we touched. I was trying to figure that out for the longest time. And then obviously with you and being in fatherhood and doing a lot of work with men and a lot of things, spiritual warfare and stuff like that, there's a place, but you have to put your core identity, you have to figure out that part first before you can figure out, once again, how to love others, right? That's what we're trying to say, I guess, throughout the whole thing. And so, that's something I'm really figuring out. And yeah, it's tough. Like I said, as a marketing major, you don't get a ton of options, and then if you're like me and you have like a little inkling towards, there's something that I really want to do, this podcast, this ministry, it can really make you question, like, okay, well, what's your role? Because not everyone's role is to go out and do ministry. Some people are just meant to have a good job to provide for their family and be a good father. So that's a tough question, but it's, I I think it's definitely one worth contemplating, and not, and as we've been pointing to before, not being contemplated enough. I think there's the side that maybe people who are getting the wrong idea, maybe I should be doing this in order to make an impact. And I think we have a lot of people who maybe say like, oh, I'm not fit to make that impact. And it's like, there's just so much more room, I think, in the Catholic realm and Christianity in general for people to place their impact, to create this counterculture, to move the kingdom, to move it back to Christendom, right? There's so much there, but we have to find our core self first.
Yeah. I mean, our Lord said the harvest is plenty and the laborers are few. So we know we got our work cut out for us. Keone, parting words.
Just as a, kind of a daily type of thing for our listeners, in every moment of every day, you'll see your parts play out. That part of you that wants control of time, that needs to be early, that part of you, which is myself, by the way, I'm pretty much just projecting to you guys right now. The part of you that, is so anxiety ridden when there's any moment of doubt. That's also me, in case you're wondering. That part of you that's impatient, that part of you that's wounded from, your family or that friend or whatever. Start to recognize those parts. Just first get curious, get to know them. Because there's parts of us that we hide, that we're frustrated with, that we haven't forgiven in ourselves. And if we can't love those parts, then how can we love someone else? Because we can't give ourselves completely to those around us when we're only giving, a piece of ourselves. And how can we love God when we're not giving our all to God? Even those parts we hate, we're frustrated with, that we haven't forgiven. And so that's where it starts, is just looking at those parts and getting to know them. And that's really what I've been trying to do is, I'm impatient. I struggle with a lot of things. Notice that and just continue to work through it. But don't come at it from a point of frustration, like I need to drill that part of me. No, I'm just going to accept it and continue to work through it. And once it's invited in back into the orchestra and you allow the conductor, which is, who God made you to be, and you fix your eyes back on him, I think he starts to heal those. Because your eyes aren't fixated on yourself and the frustration of that part, right? Now you're fixated on God, and God starts to just seep through every instrument, every player in the orchestra, and everyone's now integrated. And that's where that unity and multiplicity, meet. And so that's really our goal. So that's my only parting words for our listeners.
Makes you got anything to say?
Nah, just it'd be cool if you found your core self, to find that self to like and subscribe and stuff. I think that's right, Kelly. I think you forgot to mention that part of the theory.
That is a core tenet of internal family systems. Actually, it's liking and subscribing.
Yeah, so many parts. Right, you have your liking part, your subscribing part, and the core stuff. He really brings that in to do all of them. You know what I mean? Yeah. He wants you to do that. I think there's a following the Instagram part. There's a lot of things that you got to work out yourself. I can't do it all for you. So
yeah, I mean, be who God created you to be, right? A follower and subscriber and share of PPK.
Yeah. Dr. Peter said it best, actually. Yeah, he said if you really wanted to help yourself, just like and subscribe to PPK. It's weird. I didn't expect to shout out. Never talked to him myself, but appreciate it though.
Yeah, I mean, we always appreciate those that have been joining us and sticking with us here on PPK. We do want you to follow, like, subscribe, share with us, right? We're just trying to lead others to Christ, lead people to healing, and ultimately be who God created you to be and set this world ablaze. And so thank you for joining us. We're always humbled and honored to speak to you, to share with you on our journey. And you know how we do it. Until next time, get holy or die trying. God's peace.